When looking at the Microsoft Azure cloud, it's always interesting to compare using on-premises compute solutions versus Azure public cloud solutions. The first thing to consider is that with the public cloud, the cloud service provider, in this case Microsoft, has many data centers distributed around the globe. And it is their responsibility to ensure those data centers are physically secured and that all the infrastructure equipment within them, like servers and routers and switches and storage arrays, are configured accordingly and made available to higher level cloud services. Now, with a private cloud, by comparison, which would run on premises normally, it's owned and used by a single organization. Now, the reason we say that a private cloud normally runs on premises is because it is possible to outsource private cloud environments that are used by a single organization. It's possible to host that elsewhere with another provider. But generally speaking, a private cloud is on premises on a network owned and managed by one organization. Now, having an on-premises network environment, even without a private cloud, just using IT services on premises, provides full configuration flexibility to the owner of those services. However, it takes more time to configure things than it might in the cloud, which supports rapid provisioning of resources. And also with an on-premises environment, even though you have full configuration flexibility, it means a lot more responsibility. It also means ensuring the privacy of data in alignment with data privacy laws and regulations. So that's going to be an important aspect of comparing what we'd have to do on premises versus what's done in the cloud, because a lot of cloud service providers already have a number of security accreditations, such as for GDPR or PCI DSS, HIPAA, and many more. Let's take a minute and focus on the hardware, how it relates to on-premises versus the Microsoft Azure public cloud. When it comes to thinking about hardware, let's say on-premises with your own network, you would be responsible for acquiring the hardware and waiting for it to be shipped, which can take time. You would be responsible for the configuration of that hardware to get it up and running. Then the ongoing management, so making configuration changes over time, setting permissions, and also applying firmware updates to the hardware, to the eventual decommissioning of that hardware, which also includes sanitizing or destroying storage media to make sure that data artifacts can't be retrieved. And in the cloud, that's especially important. Microsoft Azure Cloud Computing supports all of the hardware listed here, but that's Microsoft's responsibility, not ours as a cloud customer. And when it comes to data destruction for decommissioning, Microsoft adheres to specific standards to make that happen, specifically NIST Special Publication 800-88, which is titled Guidelines for Media Sanitization. So disks are physically destroyed when they're no longer required in the data center, and there are records kept of that destruction. But there's more than just hardware to contend with. A full IT solution includes software. So how does that compare from on-premises to the Azure public cloud? Some of these things are the same types of factors we would think about when it comes to hardware, such as the acquisition of software and the licensing of that software. Sometimes understanding licensing for certain products is a large task unto itself, beyond the configuration of the software solution and the ongoing management, which would include things like configuration changes, also working with permissions, and software updates that need to be applied periodically, software patches, and the eventual decommissioning of that data. All of that is related to software. In the cloud, all of that is really taken care of. As an example, in Microsoft Azure, if we want to deploy a Microsoft SQL server, we don't have to concern ourselves with acquiring the software, licensing it, deploying the underlying virtual network and virtual machines, and installing the SQL Server software and applying software updates. That's all handled by Microsoft in the case of Azure Managed Database Solutions. Another consideration is disaster recovery for natural and person-made disasters. So the idea is that the cloud can actually serve as an alternate site where compute services can continue. So we can have IT systems already running in the cloud. We would have planned for this ahead of time. We might also have data that's been replicated from on-premises into the cloud. So the idea is that in the event of a disruption on premises, we already have our systems and our data available in the cloud. Now, depending on the nature of the solution, to switch over to the cloud version of what you've got running, you might have to change DNS records to redirect users when they refer to a name to IP addresses running in the cloud and that type of thing. Then there's the financial aspect of it. We know that with capital expenditures on premises, we're talking about the expenditures related to the acquisition of hardware and software and licensing, and also the costs associated with getting those things up and running initially and then paying for it over time. Now, that's a capital expenditure versus an operating expenditure, or OPEX, which relates to the monthly subscription costs that would be incurred using Microsoft Azure Cloud Services. We then have to consider the total cost of ownership, or the TCO. Microsoft actually includes a web page, a web-based solution for a TCO calculator, where you can add the Azure services that you anticipate you would use and start tracking what it might end up costing you. Now, because cloud service providers, in the case of public cloud computing like Microsoft Azure, have so many customers, it means that the resources are then available to that provider to provision even more and more underlying infrastructure, and also to dedicate some of those resources to securing not only their data centers, but the use of that infrastructure. Now, CSPs then have a number of security accreditations from third parties that will attest to those security standards having been met. But bear in mind, just because Microsoft Azure, for example, is HIPAA compliant, it doesn't mean that anything you do in the Azure cloud is also going to be HIPAA compliant. So part of that responsibility would also lie on the cloud customer.